Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back. I'm Eleanor, and this is the 10th day. The 10th day of the Sealy Challenge, and I'm still going. I'm really shocked at myself. I'm shocked at how much I'm loving it. It's so interesting, people push themselves in many different ways. Usually it's physically, usually it's through sports. You'll hear about people training for marathons. You don't often hear of people pushing themselves to the limit with poetry. Until now, it hasn't really been a thing. But thanks to Nicole Sealy, I have to say, I've reached such a new appreciation of what poetry adds to my life, and also the way that reading an entire book of poetry can be so different in such a positive way to reading one poem at a time every once in a while. So I thought, it being day 10, a nice number 10, I thought I'd talk a little bit about, as an example, how my day went today and how different it was from a day that wouldn't have had this pressure to read an entire book. So I haven't really planned in advance for what I'm going to read every day. I have quite a large number of books either on my shelf or on my Kobo that I never really read. It happens a lot. For whatever reason, you're very enthusiastic at the bookstore and then life moves on. And I made a list of some poets that I've always wanted to read but didn't. And so I have that in mind as well. But every evening, it's something that I really look forward to, that after I've done this video and I've had a cup of tea and I'm thinking about the next day, it's quite a treat. It's quite a treat to decide what book I'm going to choose. And last night, I actually couldn't think of one. Emblem by Lucy Mercer had such a strong effect on me yesterday that I didn't really want to leave it. I just wanted to immerse myself in it. And none of the books on my shelf really interested me. So I remembered that on my list was the name Carl Phillips, and he's an American poet. I think he's in his 60s. He's written so many books. I think at least 15, 16 books even. And I had been, listening to him on this podcast that I've mentioned before, which I highly recommend. It's called Breaking Form. And on this podcast, he's a really, really good interviewee. He's just a wonderful speaker. You can tell he's had a lot of experience speaking. I mean, he's a professor as well, but he's also a lot of fun, and he inevitably talks a lot about sex. There's a lot of sex and eroticism and generally relationships in his poems. And the two hosts there, I got their names this time, James Allen Hall and Aaron Smith, had such a good time with him. They actually had two separate episodes with him. And so I thought, this is it. And it was hard to decide what book. I was going to download it on my Kobo. And I decided on the book Wild as the Wind. And I just started reading it as I was in bed, falling asleep. And I was so surprised. I didn't realize at all what sort of a writer he is. And he's really right up my alley. He doesn't have very much absolute clarity. He has a sense, he writes with a sense of clarity, but because of the way he moves words around, because of the way he uses syntax, I suppose is the best way to put it, you'll read a sentence or two and think, oh yeah, that makes total sense, I get it. But then he'll have a clause that sort of makes sense, but then retrospectively muddies the waters of what you read previously. So you have to return to the, three. So it's taking 2 steps forward and then 3 or 4 steps back. I love that sort of stuff. And it's all about relationships. I feel that it's a lot about love relationships, and it's a lot about the physical, the erotic as well. And there's a strong energy to the poems, and they're very readable in the sense that you move quickly. You can't help it. I was turning the pages. But you don't get a sense of exactly what the result of the speaker's thoughts are. And there's a lot of ambivalence and a lot of ambiguity. And I absolutely love it. After I read about 2/3 of the book, I walked around with my Greyhound Augie and listened to a podcast, a different one, called Verses. And that's the Poetry Foundation podcast with Dennis Smith and Franny Choi. And if you can see the 2 books over there, those are their two of their books that I've had, for a month or so on my shelf and haven't read. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. I'll get to know them a little bit more. I've listened to them interview before, but I hadn't paid too much attention to them, mostly to the poet they were interviewing. And then I'll learn a bit about Carl Phillips as well. And I'll link to that podcast episode too, because it's really good. You have these 2 young poets that really admire Carl Phillips, and he doesn't use it to lord it over them. He actually is able to have a discussion with them so that all 3 of them feel that they are, that they're really on the same page. So I chose Wild as the Wind, and I had to put up with reading it on my Kobo. Look, I've said it before, I much prefer paper book for poetry. But in any case, what I decided to do is the titular poem, Wild as the Wind. And I should mention, Wild as the Wind is the name of a song famously sung by Nina Simone, then later sung by David Bowie. I'll leave a link to those 2 singers on YouTube. If you listen to that song, you can tell really the tone of this whole book. Heartbreak, trying to figure out what your feelings are, what your thoughts are about other people, how you see yourself. It's just superb. So I thought what I'd do is take this poem, Wild as the Wind. That's the second last poem it's actually, let me just check. Yes, it is. It's the second last poem in the book. And I'll just write out the last few lines. And this is something that I've started to do recently in videos, because I think while with novels, you don't want to have a spoiler, I think with poetry books, you need that spoiler. And I'll tell you why. You'll forget it anyway by the time you read the book. It's not like a narrative. It's not the spoiler of this happens. It's a spoiler of this is some of the best, this is some of the creme de la creme of this book. It's probably going to be towards the end, because poets, from what I've seen, don't put the creme de la creme right at the beginning of the book. But you've got to have the carrot. You've got to have the carrot as a goal, because to read a whole poetry book is work. And if you've been given a nibble of something delicious and nutritious to work towards, that's always, the best way. That's what I would want from a poetry review anyway. So I'll put that in, and then I'll come back and discuss it. Okay, this is a little bit, just a few lines, last few lines of Wild as the Wind, the poem of that name from the book of that name by Carl Phillips. If I refuse increasingly to explain, isn't explanation at the end of the day what the sturdier truth most resist? It's been my experience that tears are useless against all the rest of it, that if I could, I'd forget. That I keep wanting to stay should count, at least for something. I'm not done with you yet. Okay, I'm back and I've listened to a little bit of what I've just recorded, and oh my God, I'm so sorry. I seem to be, I sound more and more like I'm some sort of teacher or professor. I am no such thing. I'm an absolute nobody. I'm Eleanor in Australia who gets a kick out of reading poetry. I'm just a poetry lover. So I'm sorry if I sound like I'm teaching you something. Now let me have a cup of tea and I'll continue teaching you something. Okay. So as you can see from, the little bit that I wrote out, what Carl Phillips is doing is trying to focus his mind, and therefore our minds as the readers, on the ephemeral feelings and thoughts, the fleeting emotions that we might have when we're with someone, a friend, or probably a lover, or when we're just thinking of them, when we're fantasizing, or when we're in an actual real relationship in real time. And of course, it's impossible to capture that in writing, but the goal really for him, and poetry allows you to do this, is to really stretch the language, to stretch it out, is what I'm thinking of, until some of the gaps between the words start to shimmer and point to unusual other words. And look, maybe you can call it messing up syntax, but I mean, what does that really mean? I'm not even, he himself says he's not sure what syntax is. This is just how he writes. So I think if you read this book, even if you're not paying a whole lot of attention to it, if you're not close reading it, if you just read it cover to cover, I think it will definitely have an effect on you, because you're going to be more aware the next time you're with your lover, whoever that might be, or just by yourself, thinking about someone from the past maybe, or fantasizing about someone in the future. You'll somehow be more aware of your thoughts. It's a kind of meditation on love, his poetry. I think that's the best way to describe it. So that brings me to the next 2 days, tomorrow and the day after, and I have decided to read these 2 little books, one by Franny Choi, the other by Denise Smith, and see how I go with that. I'm sure they're going to be absolutely different from Carl Phillips, which is a good thing. I want to mix it up. Okay, so I will see you tomorrow. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.